Okay, so here we go. Great crowd, and a great presentation from Chris. I want to thank him for that. That's the cover of the book. It's available now at Amazon.com. Now, I want to tell you, like, it's Selling America Short, the New World Order versus the American Middle Class. Now, I'm a middle class guy. It's true, I'm also a Wall Street guy, and I did very well for myself on Wall Street, and I'm very happy about that. But the bottom line is, you know, I'm a middle class guy, so I can see it from both angles. And what I want to tell you is, the middle class is about to get screwed very, very badly in the U.S. I mean, what you've seen up to this point is nothing, right? I know that everyone's having a tough time out there, but really, this is really just the beginning of it. And it's not a conspiracy theory. It's really, I think, it's a form of ineptitude, but it's like institutionally driven ineptitude would be one way to put it. In other words, I don't think that there's an evil conspiracy to destroy the middle class. I think that we follow policies because the people who control our money, the Fed, Ben Bernanke, people like that, they believe certain things. They have a belief system. They believe the things they learned in school. Okay? And the things they learned in school are going to kill us. They're going to kill us. And we can't stop them because we don't elect the Fed chairman. The Fed chairman has become more powerful than the president. Now, how did that happen, first of all? That's probably an interesting point to start. Let's talk about that for just a minute. Why is the Fed so powerful? Why is the Fed what it is today? How did it get this way? I'm going to tell you a little story. Now, I'm not going to bore you with jargon. There's a million books out there that do that. There's a million people out there who can bore you with jargon. I am not going to do that. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about some people. Right? You see, let's say we have a few characters here. We have a few characters. And my book is going to have some fictional characters that appear occasionally. One of them is a character named Fireman Ed. Fireman Ed is a very interesting character in my book. He's a fireman, and his two buddies, Joey and Mongo, they run a gas station. Jim and Mongo, I should say. Jim and Mongo run a gas station, and they're at the gas station. Here comes the fire engine. They know Fireman Ed is on the truck. He's their buddy from high school. And, of course, they're going to give him a hard time when they see him. They're going to say, what are you going to do? You're going to get a cat down from a tree. What are you doing here, Fireman Ed? And Fireman Ed says, well, listen, you losers, I'm here to make sure that big building across the street, I'm here to make sure that it does not lose power. I'm here to make sure that it doesn't lose energy. So I'm going to go over there and reroute the power and make sure that the lights don't go out and the heat stays on. So Fireman Ed does that. He reroutes the power, and when he leaves on the fire truck, what do you know? All the lights in the building are out, and the heat is off. So they have to call Fireman Ed back. They have to call him back, right? And now he's Lieutenant Ed because, you know, there's been so many emergencies popping up, he keeps getting promoted. Now that the power is out and the heat's out in the building, Fireman Ed, now he's Lieutenant Ed, goes over, he starts a series of small fires in the basement of the building. That way, the people will stay warm. He has to keep them safe. He has to help them. So he's going to start a little fire to keep them warm. Except he accidentally burns the building down and half the town with it. But somehow, the next time his friends see him, Fireman Ed, who became Lieutenant Ed, is now Mayor Ed. How does this keep happening? The worse the disasters become, the more powerful Fireman Ed becomes until Fireman Ed is basically running the town. A complete buffoon, right? Now, that's kind of a silly story, isn't it? We don't believe that anyone could become the mayor of a town by setting it on fire, do we? It's ridiculous. It's absurd. Let me tell you, let's move along to a different area. I'm just going to skip around a little bit. Let's move along a little bit. Now I want to tell you about the King of the USA. Now, did you know that there was a King of the USA? Did you know that? You might think, well, the U.S. is a democracy. It doesn't have a king. Well, the King of the USA controls every dollar in your pocket. He can do anything he wants with your money. He can make prices go up. He can make prices rise. He can make prices fall. He can make a currency worthless. He can do all of this. Now, usually when an economy goes bad, they blame the president. This always happens. Or when an economy is good, they give the president credit. The truth is, the president usually has nothing to do with it. All right? And we shouldn't even be worried about the president of the United States because the president is an elected official. He can be voted out of office. But the King of the United States cannot be voted out of office. There is no check and balance on the King of the United States. He is not elected, and therefore he cannot be voted out of office. He can destroy your wealth, and there's nothing you can do about it. He can lend billions of dollars to his friends without telling you, both at home and abroad. He can raise the price of food and gasoline and the rent, and you are powerless to stop him. Now, what's it? You don't think there's a king? Sure, there's a King of the USA. He doesn't have to answer to you. How did he become so powerful? How did this king become so powerful? Exactly the same way that Fireman Ed became powerful. And of course, the King of the USA is the Federal Reserve. How did the Federal Reserve become powerful? Just like Fireman Ed. Fireman Ed became mayor by burning down the town. All right? And by creating a series of emergencies. And every emergency, they felt, well, he needs more power. If only Fireman Ed had had more power and more authority, he could have dealt with this. He could have helped things. Well, the Fed is the exact same way. The Fed was created in 1913. Okay? It's only about 100 years old. All right? Only about 100 years old. How does the Fed become so powerful in 100 years? Well, first of all, you've got to remember, the American public is sold on the Fed. How are they sold? How do they sell it to the American public? They sell it to the American public by telling them that the Fed is now there's going to be a central bank, and they're going to come along, and they're going to prevent all the recessions and depressions and all the volatility. They're going to manage the economy, and that way there won't be any more recessions. There won't be any more depressions, right? And this was in 1913. What happened in 1929? Not even 20 years later. The Great Depression occurs, less than 20 years after the institution of the Fed. Now, right then, people should have understood that this whole thing's a scam. The Federal Reserve is a complete scam. It's there. First of all, there were two central banks in the U.S. before the Federal Reserve. Before the Fed, there were two. And one of them was put under, you might say, by Andrew Jackson, who said that his greatest accomplishment was destroying the central bank because the central bank was trying to take over the country. But people forget, and people don't know, and they get lulled to sleep, and then we create some fake emergencies, and we can bring the Fed back into power, and this happens in 1913. Now, of course, who created the Fed? Who's behind it? The Fed is created by the big banks. That's right. In other words, they sold it to the American people by telling you that the Fed was going to protect you, the American people, from the economy. But the economy gets more and more crazy, and the more involved the Fed gets, the more crazy it gets. It's just like Fireman Ed. And every time things go wrong, the Fed becomes more powerful. They ask for and they are granted more power. This has been happening recently as well. So the Fed is now running the show. Okay? Now this is amazing, isn't it? But who created the Fed? It was the big bankers. The big bankers said, if we need to have a central bank so that if we ever screw up, somebody will be there to bail us out. We'll tell the American people that the Fed is there for their sake, and that way we'll convince them to accept it, but really, the Fed's there for us. That way, we can do whatever we want, and we can We can do all kinds of crazy things with our money. We can place wild bets, and if we screw up, we will be bailed out because the Fed will be there. We'll create the Fed for us. It's created by the wealthy and for the wealthy, and it's not for me, and it's not for you. It's against us. Okay? Now, let's get to this whole part about screwing the little people, because that's kind of interesting. How are they going to do that? They actually managed to do this. What I have to teach you very briefly here, and it's not hard, is the difference between real wages and nominal wages. Bear with me. This is not hard. And I'm going to keep everything simple. Bear with me for just a second. It's a con game. They're going to play a con game with you. By the way, I included some great quotes about currencies along the way. I love this one from Ernest Hemingway. The first panacea for a mismanaged nation is inflation of the currency. The second is war. Both bring a temporary prosperity. Both bring permanent ruin. But both are the refuge of political and economic opportunists. That's the inflation of the currency and war. So how are they going to con the American people? How are they going to screw the 99%, so to speak? And the truth is, this is not an Occupy Wall Street thing. This is a Tea Party. It's not a Tea Party thing. Everybody should be furious about this. There are a lot of people that are very unhappy in this country right now. And they're for very good reason, but they don't really know why. They can't put their finger on it. They're kind of mad at Wall Street, but they're not really sure what's the difference between the Federal Reserve and Goldman Sachs and the local bank down at the corner. They don't really, you know what I mean? They haven't fully thought it through. Well, I'll tell you something. Here's how they're going to screw you. Let's say you're making $50,000 a year, which is $24 an hour, approximately. Now you're going to get a raise. Hooray! You're going to get a 2% raise. Your nominal wages go up by 2%. Now you're making more money than ever. But inflation goes up by 3%. So your real wages are +2, that's your raise, -3, that's inflation. You end up with -1. You lose 1% of your wealth. Even though you have more money than you ever had before, you're now 1% poorer. Now, this is actually very close to the recent numbers. The recent numbers mirror this very closely. The recent numbers are this, and the numbers I used for the book this was just from April. Nominal wages overall in the U.S. went up by 1.7%, but inflation was up by 2.6%. So you gain 1.7%, you lose 2.6%. In the end, you are net. You lose 0.9%. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong about that? What's wrong is this inflation number is actually much higher. If you think inflation's running at 2% in the U.S. right now, then you might as well just log out now because there's nothing I can do to help you. The inflation numbers are grossly understated, I should say. They're grossly understated. The inflation numbers are not to be believed. The government underreports inflation, so they won't have to give a big raise to everybody who collects a check. Okay, now you know this, most likely. So really, you're getting more money, but you're poorer. Now, who would have ever thought of such a thing? The answer is John Maynard Keynes. Keynesian economics is named for John Maynard Keynes, and he thought this would be a good idea because, you can't just steal money from the working class. You can't just cut their wages. So what you do instead is you give them a raise, but you raise prices faster. How can you do that? How can you raise prices faster? Well, the Fed creates inflation by increasing the supply of money. Let me ask you something. Your whole life, you've seen prices go up, right? Your whole life. Gradually, the cost of everything has gone higher and higher. Is that normal? Do you think it's just the natural tendency of things that prices should always go higher? Maybe not by much, but just a little bit. Why do all central banks have a target rate of inflation that is a positive number? 2%, 3%? Is that normal? Are prices supposed to go up, up, up for all eternity? Or have we just been led to believe that this is normal, or it's all we've ever known, so we accept it? The truth is, it's engineered by central banks. And they're very upfront about this. You know, the BOE wants to see inflation at 2%. They have a target rate for inflation, right? Why isn't it zero? Why is it not zero? Well, so remember, central banks are there to protect the wealthy. And remember, and they're created by the wealthy for the wealthy. So if a central bank raises interest rates, or so if it allows inflation, if they're going to allow inflation, who does that hurt and who does it benefit? Imagine a building. Imagine an apartment building. If prices go up, is that going to hurt the person who pays the rent or the person who owns the building? Who's going to benefit from inflation? Is it the tenant or the landlord? It's the landlord. Why? Because the Fed says so. The Fed says we need to have inflation. They're scared to death right now that we're not going to have inflation. They're doing everything they can to create inflation. This is a Keynesian economic model. They believe the reason why nobody's buying anything is because there's not enough money. That's insane. But this is what they believe. This is what they learned in school, and this is what they're forcing on the rest of us. This is from Ron Paul, a little quote from Ron Paul's book, End the Fed. Talking about the difference between real wages and nominal wages, raising the nominal wage and lowering the real wage at the same time. This is a quote from Ron Paul. As a matter of fact, Keynes advocated it. He realized that in a slump that real wages had to go down, and he believed that you could get real wages down by inflation, keep the nominal wage up, have the real wage come down, and sort of deceive the working man. That was Ron Paul speaking to Ben Bernanke in front of the U.S. Financial Services Committee about 5 years ago. Okay, so that is how they're taking advantage of you. That's how it's being done. Now, this is all being done, I would say, zero. Sorry about that. Lost the audio for a minute there. Zebra, I would say put Ron Paul in charge of the Fed. Personally, that would be my choice. But let me, but what happens? So really, the central banks create this inflation because they were created by the wealthy to support the wealthy, and they're going to do it at everybody else's expense. But they're doing this. This is like crazy, though. They're telling you to drink the poison, basically. Drink the poison. It's for your own good. They're not saying it's poison. They'll never tell you it's poison. But they have to sort of convince you that it's for your own good. More quantitative easing is good. It'll weaken the dollar, and that's good. None of that makes any sense at all. It's all completely wrong. A weak dollar creates poverty. It does not create, they say it creates jobs, right? Oh, they're going to create all these jobs. Right. But what are you going to get paid? You're going to get paid in dollars, right? So if they weaken the dollar, they're going to get paid in devalued money. The money that you're paid with isn't worth as much. So you're poor. You're like a slave. It's worse than, the truth is, it's like a form of slavery. And it's almost worse than slavery. You know why? I'll tell you what, in this book, I also have a chapter. It's a hypothetical scenario. slave owner is out in his field, and he falls into a wormhole, and he goes 200 years into the future. And he meets a British gentleman. A British gentleman who is also from the past as well. They've both fallen into this wormhole. And they've both landed in the future. The slave owner tells the British gentleman, I was out in the field minding my slaves, and the next thing I knew, I was here in this strange place. And the British gentleman tells him, how dare you assume that you can own another person? You are a barbarian. Do you understand me? You are a barbarian. These slaves of yours, do they live on your property? And the slave owner says, yes, they do. And he says, and then the British gentleman asks him, do you feed them? Do you clothe them? And the slave owner says, of course, we're not complete barbarians. And the British gentleman tells him, yes, you are. You are a barbarian precisely because you clothe and feed and house your slaves. Because if we can basically the gist being that the slave owner's methods are outdated. The modern form of slavery, you don't have to house the slave. He houses himself. You don't have to clothe the slave. You don't have to feed him. He'll clothe himself, he'll feed himself, he'll buy his own house or his own apartment, and he'll be enslaved by this economic system that is going to make him gradually poorer and poorer and poorer, and he's not going to understand why it's happening. And he's going to get upset. They're getting upset right now in the U.S. They're getting very upset, but they still don't quite get it. They still don't quite understand why they're getting screwed and how it's happening. So they're all turning against each other. Meanwhile, the economy is still screwed up, so the Fed needs more power, undoubtedly. And this is all happening because central banks are not there to protect you. They're to protect the wealthy, and they're basically there to screw you. Okay? All right. Now, this actually happened. I don't know if you see this graphic. Do you think gold could go to 100 trillion an ounce? Where's gold today? About 1,600 something? 16 something. Could it go to 100 trillion? This did happen in Germany because what the Fed is doing by printing all this money, this has been done in the past many times before. Why do you think it is that in Europe the Germans are so reluctant to print money? The ECB is not printing money to bail out Europe because of the reluctance of the Germans to do so. Why? Because people in Germany have a collective memory. They know what happened in Germany. The Weimar Republic, 1919 through 1923, the price of gold went from 100 German marks to 100 trillion German marks in a space of less than 4 years. Did gold become much more valuable, or did the currency become much less valuable? But you see, you got to understand something. Who's going to get screwed when something like this happens? The person who saved up money, has money in the bank, some CDs, that money becomes worthless. And meanwhile, the wealthy who own real estate, their property that used to cost $100,000, it goes up to $1 million, then it goes up to $1 billion. They're protected. They own hard assets. Working class people don't own a lot of hard assets. And they're going to lose everything. They're going to lose everything. Now, let me tell you a little story. And guys, I'm not actually looking at your comments. Forgive me for that. I'm just kind of going off on my own here. But that actually happened in Germany. And it actually happens over and over and over again. I'm going to read you a story that's a little bit scary. I interviewed a lot of different people for this book. I'm going to read one of those interviews for you now. You see, through MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I was put in touch with people from around the world who had lived through currency collapses. Let's see what happens when the currency collapses. First, I'm going to take you to Zimbabwe. You know, Zimbabwe was not a poor country. I mean, it's the most miserable place to live on earth right now, but it's not a poor country. Did you know Zimbabwe has a lot of gold, a lot of diamonds, a lot of farmland? It's not a poor country. Here's what happened. I'm going to read it to you from a gentleman I interviewed over there. I protected everyone's identity because everybody I spoke to broke some kind of law at one time or another. Why? Because, well, in Zimbabwe, it was illegal to trade in currencies other than the Zimbabwe dollar. Let's see what happened. When it started, we realized that keeping money in the bank was no longer a wise thing. By the end of the month, the money would be worthless. So to protect wealth, people started to buy assets in the form of building materials, which was easy to store, or they would buy houses. The cycle continued, inflation rose, and with time we realized that prices would change from morning to afternoon to the evening. The price of a loaf of bread would change from afternoon to evening. So we started using more stable currencies, U.S. dollars, for example. This was the only way we were able to make plans. On the business side, we realized all the customers wanted to operate on a prepayment schedule. Everybody wanted to pay now, while the money was still worth something, and take delivery later. Sometimes you'd make a payment, and by the time it was reflected in the account, the prices had changed. After a while, a loaf of bread cost $1 million, then it cost $2 million. This went on until the U.S. dollar was introduced, but some Zim dollars remained, which became like tokens. But the economy had already changed to U.S. dollars. After that, nobody wanted Zim dollars. From the supply side, the stores were empty. You couldn't find anything. We would travel to South Africa to buy groceries for our staff and also pots and pans, utensils, etc. You couldn't trade well legally, okay? You couldn't exchange currencies on the legal market, but you would go to the black market. So we arranged to do business outside of normal channels. This was, by the way, that was illegal. This is why I'm not revealing the names of anyone who's involved in this. Some people took advantage of us. They would overcharge you, of course, but everything would lose value very quickly. The people who lost their fortunes, who lost everything they had, were the people who had all their money in cash. They did not have hard assets. One day I went to the bank and exchanged $50 US for 500 trillion Zimbabwe dollars. The money, how did the money get into the bank, the U.S. dollars? The Zimbabweans would be working abroad, they'd be working in the U.S., and they'd send that money home. And and life became a nightmare. It was very difficult. People didn't have food. Meat was a nightmare. You could only buy meat in unbearable, unsanitary places. There was nothing to eat. The avenue taken by some was to find employment. They'd get a job in South Africa so they could be paid in South African rand. There was no learning going on in school because of this situation. The rural people did not have seeds for planting. They used them in soup. They would eat the seeds, and then there were no crops. This made things even worse. A lot of people died. The public hospitals couldn't function. The only option was a private hospital. Most people could not afford a private hospital. So a lot of people died because of lack of access to medical care. Families were destroyed in the process. Everyone was just doing everything they could to try to make a living, to try to find food. You would even have people trying to get to South Africa by swimming across a crocodile-infested river. And some people would be swept away by the river. Some people would be eaten by crocodiles in an effort to get across the river. Which way? Either way you go, you die. If you stay in Zimbabwe, you die. There's nothing. You're doomed. Why? This all had to do with politics. If you get the politics wrong, everything will crumble around that. Now, That's some scary stuff right there. And Zimbabwe is the most obvious example. I've got the camera off for a second. Zimbabwe is the most obvious example. But this happens all over the world. I interviewed people from Brazil, Peru. I interviewed people from, Bulgaria, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. In addition to Zimbabwe, other countries as well, really too many to name. And I just sort of sprinkled these interviews throughout the book just to sort of remind you how horrible life can become when the currency is debased. The countries that remember, the countries that have had a recent activity like this are the ones who are not going to print money. The countries who don't remember, or who have not learned the lessons of history, are the ones that do print money. So you'll notice the ECB is not printing money, are they? The European Central Bank is not printing money because Germans remember the currency collapse of the 1920s. Even Zimbabwe doesn't want to use the U.S. dollar anymore. Hello? Wake up call. Zimbabwe, where the currency collapsed just a few years ago, now doesn't want the U.S. dollar anymore. They're saying, we're going to create our own asset-backed currency. We have plenty of gold in this country. We have plenty of diamonds. We will create our own asset-backed currency. And we want to get away from the dollar. Other countries are trying their best to get away from the dollar. They see it coming. They know. Americans don't know. We've never lived through anything like this before. But people all around the world have lived through it, and once you read this book, you're going to feel like you lived through it too. I mean, I interviewed people who had to wait in line at a gas station for 3 days to get 4 or 5 gallons of gas. 3 days they'd have to wait. All kinds of nasty tricks that were played. You know, the government would make money. The money became rationed, right? They would only allow you to take 500 Zimbabwe dollars out of the bank. Why? Because they were sticking you with it. It was losing its value and you couldn't take it out. You were losing your wealth. Meanwhile, who's getting the money? Who's able to do that? The friends of the government were allowed to pull their money out. Everybody else had to leave theirs in. So the government made themselves more powerful. Mugabe's government made themselves more powerful by creating this situation and then using it to make their supporters wealthier than their opponents. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are all things that actually happened, and it's all documented. Okay? This is recent history. All right, folks? Now, let me show you something that happens when the currency gets destroyed. And here's a link to the book, by the way. Please pick it up. It's only $22. Okay? Please pick up a copy. Let me show you what happens. Let me show you some pretty pictures here. Here's a quote. By the way, you've heard of Websters Dictionary, right? Here's a quote from Daniel Webster. We are in danger of being overwhelmed with irredeemable paper, just paper, representing not gold or silver, no sir, but broken promises, bad faith, bankrupt corporations, cheated creditors, and a ruined people. Daniel Webster said this before the U.S. Senate in 1833. What was going on in 1833? The U.S. had a central bank. For many years after that, they did not have a central bank until the Fed was created in 1913. Now, once you start printing paper, nobody goes into printing mode saying, let's destroy the currency completely. At least I don't think so. I don't think people are evil. I just think they're stupid sometimes. And that's probably a lot more easy to believe. And really, a lot of it's not even stupid. It's just lack of common sense. I think we have a lot of very educated, very intelligent people. I think Ben Bernanke is a very well-educated, intelligent person. I think a lot of the economists out there are very educated and intelligent. I just don't think they have common sense. Because it's happened over and over and over again, all through history. What's that? That's 10 million Pengo from Hungary, 1945. That's a 10. So once you start, in other words, once you start the presses, nobody starts the presses thinking, yeah, let's print money and let's print up some $10 million bills. No, it doesn't happen like that. It happens gradually. Things spin out of control. Once people realize the money is losing its value, they try to get rid of it. Everyone's trying to get rid of it as fast as they can. And so you go into a panic mode, and then some very unusual things come flying out of the printing press. One thing that comes out of the printing press is this. This is a 10 million Pengo note from Hungary, 1945. This is about the worst case of inflation ever. Now, right now, you've heard of the Hungarian forint, right? You've heard of that. Well, by August of 1946, by 1944, the highest denomination was 1,000 Pengo, a 1,000 Pengo bill. This is a 100 million, this is a 10 million Pengo bill, rather, 10 million Pengo. Guess what? In 1944, the highest denomination was 1,000. By August of 46, 2 years later, one Hungarian forint was worth 400 octillion Pengo. How would you feel if you'd worked hard all your life and saved up a lot of Pengo? Right? Become completely worthless. I included some interesting quotes, too. Those who create and issue money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people. That's Reginald McKenna. He is the former Chancellor of the Exchequer of England, which is sort of like the Treasury Secretary of the United States. No list would be complete without the $100 trillion bill from Zimbabwe. Okay? That's from 2008. And at this point, in 2008, prices were doubling every day. Not just the price of oil or the price of bread. The price of everything was doubling every day on average. So, if a loaf of bread costs $1 on Monday, it's $2 on Tuesday, $4 on Wednesday, $8 on Thursday, $16 on Friday, $32 on Saturday because inflation doesn't take the weekend off, and $64 on Sunday. It just cost $1 a week before. Now it costs $64 a week later, and then it just keeps going. Okay. Interesting quote. This is from the former president of the Bank of England, a man named Sir Josiah Stamp. He said, bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with a flick of the pen, they will create enough to buy it back. They sure will. This is a 10 billion dinar note. This is from Yugoslavia, circa 1933. That's Nikola Tesla on the bill, the great Nikola Tesla. Right? But boy, I wonder if he really would have wanted to have been remembered in this way, immortalized on a bill that basically, is a symbol of failure. He's a great inventor. Here he sits on a note, a 10 billion dinar note from Yugoslavia. The currency is completely destroyed. Of course, everybody lost all their wealth unless they had it in hard assets. Here's an interesting quote this is from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. The decrease in purchasing power incurred by holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issuers of money. In other words, the bank is pumping out the money. It's making you poor, and it's making themselves rich. And who said it? The Fed said it. You even have honest people in the Fed sprinkled around, right? This is a 1 billion mark note. Or is it a million or a billion? I think it's a 1 million mark. This is from Germany, 1923. Imagine if you'd worked hard all your life, saved up 1 million German marks, and suddenly 1 million German marks can't even buy a loaf of bread. How would you feel? naturally, this is carried to the extreme. But what I'm trying to point out is currency collapses are not, it's not just something that happened in Germany. It's not just something that happened in Zimbabwe. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. That's from former U.S. President James Garfield. And you're looking at Greek drachma. That's 25,000 drachma, but the exchange rate they changed to a new drachma, right? The exchange rate, if all you had to do was turn in 50 billion old drachma, and you get one new one. That's nice. This is a 10 million Cordoba note, from Yugoslavia. That's, from Nicaragua. Get tired here. 10 million Cordoba note from Nicaragua about 20 years ago. Right. So in 79, a dollar was worth 10 Cordobas. 9 years later, you would have to take 10,000 old Cordobas, and you would get in exchange and get one new one. Then 4 years after that, the new ones were exchanged for even newer ones at a rate of 5 million to 1. So naturally, if you were all in cash, you didn't have hard assets, you lost everything. So this is basically a con. And I'll just run through these really quick. These are Russian rubles. In 1991, $1 was worth 40 rubles. By 1997, $1 was worth 5,000 rubles. Okay? And this is Bolivia. 5 million peso note from 1985. You could exchange 1 million pesos for 1 Boliviano in 87. This is Bosnia, 100 million dinar from Bosnia from 1993. 1 year earlier, the highest denomination was 1,000. They went from 1,000 to 100 million. Great quote from Daniel Webster again: of all the contrivances for cheating the laboring classes of mankind, none has been more effective than that which deludes them with paper money. That is a fantastic quote. This last one's from Brazil. That's a 500,000 note from Brazil. So the point I'm trying to make is this con game has been played over and over again through history. But who falls prey to a con? Who is victimized? Who does the con artist seek? Does the con artist seek out a person who understands the con game? Does the con artist seek out someone who was recently victimized by the same scam? No, of course not. The con artist relies on finding victims who don't understand the con game. And the victim that is ripe right now for falling prey to this con is the American citizen. The currency actually did collapse in the U.S. in the 1790s, but there's no collective memory about that now. That happened too long ago. You know, there are probably not a lot of people alive right now in Germany who remember the currency collapse of 1920s, but it wasn't that long ago, and there's a lot of history about it. There's a lot of families who remember their parents who were victimized by it. And of course, when you have that type of economic instability, it can lead to political stability. So when I talk to you about the currency collapsing in Germany in the 1920s, you don't have to collect the dots too far to think about what happened to Germany later in the 1920s and in the early 1930s. The roots of that are based in the currency collapse of the early 1920s. So you see, this is victimization. It's a con game. Americans are ready to fall prey to this con game. It can be prevented. How? If they understand the game, if somebody were to warn the American people before this could happen to them and explain to them what's happening and how it's happened over and over again, then it can be prevented. And that's why I wrote this book, to try to prevent this con game from happening to the American people, where your wealth is stolen away and you're basically become an economic slave. It's happened over and over again all through history, and it can be prevented. That's why I wrote this book. I hope you'll read it. I hope you'll enjoy it. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this topic, but I injected a lot of humor into the book because I'd rather laugh than cry. Also, I didn't use a lot of jargon in the book. I didn't make it into something. In other words, there's a lot of guys like me who understand this stuff. The average person doesn't. So I wrote it on a level that anybody could understand this. And I think it's technically a book that could possibly change the world. Because imagine if everybody understood this con game was about to be played on them, they could prevent it. And that indeed would prevent an awful lot of people from being hurt. And that's really the whole point of this book, because the people that are going to be hurt are the middle class of the United States. That's where I'm from. That's where I always pledge my allegiance to the middle class of the United States. I'll always be. That's where my heart will always be. So I learned a few things on Wall Street, but I want to use those things to help everybody on Main Street. That's about all I got to say about that. So everybody, thank you for listening. Have a great day. I believe this was recorded for future use. I'll try to entertain any questions that you have in the remaining time that we have. Let me see what we got here. I'm going to turn off the camera, but please do pick up a copy of this book. If you like it, please tell someone about it. Very important stuff. Okay, I'm sorry I missed out on all your comments, but all right, that's going to do it for me. My name's Ed Ponsi. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day. To all my regulars here on FX Street, I'll see you again next week. Everybody else, I certainly hope you pick up that book. I think it could be something that would be very useful for you and your friends. All right, have a great day. Take care.